Welcome to the first episode of Bust Big Pharma. I'm Rob Burgess. And before we talk about legislation, before we talk about earnings calls, before we talk about advertising budgets or even most favored nation pricing, we need to talk about something much more fundamental: trust. Because when trust collapses in healthcare, everything else starts to wobble. And right now in America, trust in the pharmaceutical industry is not just wobbling, it's eroding. Not because Americans don't believe in medicine, we do. Not because Americans oppose innovation, we embrace it. And not because Americans reject capitalism, we created it. But because Americans can see a disconnect between what they're told and what they're living. And that disconnect is why this show and Americans for Pharma Reform exists. Bust Big Pharma is a project of Americans for Pharma Reform. We're not anti-medicine. We're not anti-innovation. And we're not anti-profit. We are anti-exploitation. We believe in American scientific leadership. We believe in breakthrough therapies. We believe in rewarding real research and risk-taking. But we do not believe that American families should be paying the highest prescription drug prices in the developed world. We do not believe that seniors should ration insulin while executives collect 8-figure compensation packages. We do not believe that nearly 1,000 drug price increases in a single year represents a balanced marketplace. And we do not believe that a $6 billion advertising machine reflects an industry under financial strain. We believe in putting patients before profits. And that belief is not fringe, it's not ideological, and it's not radical. It is overwhelmingly supported by the American people. Let me explain. In our nationwide polling, more than 3/4 of likely voters say prescription drug prices are increasing. Not stabilizing, not moderating, increasing. 2/3 say healthcare overall is on the wrong track. But here's the number that should stop every executive in their tracks. More than 80% of Americans say that the pharmaceutical industry prioritizes profits over patients. 80%. When was the last time we heard about 80% of Americans agreeing on anything? That's not a partisan number. That's not a narrow slice of the electorate. This is a cultural consensus. When 4 out of 5 Americans believe your industry puts profits before patients, you do not have a messaging problem. You have a credibility problem. And credibility cannot be fixed with better advertising. It cannot be fixed with press releases. It cannot be fixed with polished testimonies before Congress. It can only be fixed with alignment between rhetoric and reality. And that alignment does not exist today. Just the other day, the House Energy and Commerce Subcommittee on Health held a hearing about the rising healthcare costs in America. It should have been the perfect moment for accountability. It should have been a perfect moment for clarity. Instead, it was all choreographed. The Washington Post summarized the outcome bluntly and clearly, saying, quote, "Large drug makers have emerged as perhaps the biggest winner following a marathon hearing on Capitol Hill focused on the increasing costs of medicines." The biggest winner at a hearing about high drug prices? That sentence alone explains why this podcast exists. Because when hearings end and the industry wins, when price hikes continue and the trade association representing the industry shrugs, when executives stay home and surrogates read talking points, the American people take notice. The trade association Pharma declined to send its chief executive officer to the hearing. They sent their COO instead. And at one point during questioning, the response from that person essentially was, quote, "We don't have the knowledge because we're a trade association. You would have to talk to one of the companies." Let's pause for a second. Pharma exists to lobby Congress on behalf of the industry when it comes to drug pricing. Pharma shapes healthcare legislation on behalf of its industry. Pharma influences policy frameworks. But when asked about the specific pricing decisions that are driving frustration for Americans across this country, suddenly they're a bystander? That's not ignorance. That's insulation. That is institutional buffering. And it has worked for decades, but not anymore. Because Americans are not confused. They feel the impact that this industry has on our lives, our families, and our pocketbooks. The trade association Pharma testified the other day, quote, "The competitive dynamics in the market for prescription medicines have worked successfully to balance innovation, patient access, and cost containment." We need to dissect that for a second. Competitive dynamics? Here's the English translation for you. Abstract forces. Balance. Subjective framing. Innovation. That's their emotional shield. Cost containment. That's the claim they made that is least supported by the evidence that we can all see with our own eyes. Here's the reality. Since the beginning of this year alone, 2026, nearly 1,000 drugs have seen price increases. 1,000. Meanwhile, analysis shows launch list prices for new drugs have increased dramatically in recent years, all while CEO compensation packages regularly exceed $10 million. But don't worry, the big pharmaceutical companies continue to do stock buybacks. Their marketing budgets continue to grow. And we're told cost containment is functioning. Now let's add polling to the equation. When voters are informed about what drug makers are doing and that drug makers have increased prices on nearly 1,000 medications this year alone, 84% say that they hold Big Pharma responsible for the high prices we see today. 84%. That's not messaging failure. That is legitimacy failure. Big Pharma's most reliable defense is innovation. Quote, "We must be able to earn a sufficient return on investment." Quote, "High prices fund research." Quote, "Without strong margins, cures disappear." It sounds persuasive. It sounds noble even. And it definitely sounds necessary. But when we peel the layers back on that onion, the argument weakens. In 2025, the pharmaceutical industry profit margins outpaced the S&P 500 by roughly 5%. One drug maker reached $1 trillion market valuation, and executive compensation packages climbed. And a former U.S. Senate economist, David Dittel, stated that there is, quote, "no clear quantitative evidence that lowering drug prices would undermine innovation." No clear evidence. That matters. That matters because innovation should be defended, but profit maximization disguised as innovation and the protection of innovation should not. When Americans learn that marketing budgets for Big Pharma far exceeds many research and development growth rates, when Americans learn that billions are spent on direct-to-consumer advertising, when Americans learn that executives earn 8 figures while prices rise, support for reform of the big pharmaceutical industry skyrockets. Here's another key insight for you. More than 3/4 of voters say they are less likely to support a candidate for office who accepts significant campaign contributions from the pharmaceutical industry. That is not a small signal. That is a warning across the bow. The American people are connecting the dots. They are connecting price hikes with profit margins. They are connecting advertising saturation with affordability struggles. And they are connecting lobbying expenditures with policy inertia. And that connection is reshaping the political landscape. There is something deeper happening here, though. This is not just an economic issue. This is a cultural issue that we're looking at. when 80% of Americans believe that your industry prioritizes profits over patients, when 3/4 say they distrust your pricing practices, when majorities support structural reform of your industry. That is not partisan backlash. That is not red versus blue. This is moral frustration. Americans do not begrudge success. They do not resent wealth. They do not oppose innovation, but they do resent imbalance. They do resent exploitation. They do resent feeling like they are the global ATM machine for pharmaceutical profits. And that feeling is growing because the data supports it, because the lived experiences that Americans have day to day supports it, because the contradiction is visible. For decades, this issue was politically radioactive. Republicans defended the industry margins. Democrats attacked rhetorically but rarely delivered on structural change. The result, we found ourselves in a stalemate. That stalemate is officially broken. President Trump has made it clear America will no longer subsidize the rest of the world's pharmaceutical costs. Secretary Kennedy has placed affordability at the center of reform conversations. And Dr. Oz is engaging lawmakers to codify pricing fairness. And the American people are ready. Polling shows that 80% support tying U.S. drug prices to the lowest prices paid in other nations. 80%. When you reach that level of bipartisan support, you are no longer in ideological territory. You are in consensus territory. You are in mandate territory. And consensus creates political momentum. Now layer in a headline that we saw in Axios just the other day, based off of that congressional hearing that we were talking about earlier. That headline was, quote, Big Pharma financially unfazed by drug price deals. They're unfazed. That word alone dismantles months of fear-mongering. Axios reports that major drug companies barely mentioned their pricing agreements with the Trump administration during their earnings calls this quarter, because the agreements had, quote, little to no noticeable impact on their bottom line. Little to no noticeable impact. Rob Smith from Capital Alpha Partners was quoted in that article saying, if you have engaged in something that materially changed your outlook, you have to communicate that. The fact they're not saying much kind of tells you what you need to know. It tells you that reforms did not break them. It tells you resilience remains. It tells you that price concessions are survivable. Dr. Oz suggested the adjustments were manageable, saying, quote, the sector did okay. That's the contradiction. Public alarm with private calm. Public warnings of collapse with private assurances of resilience. And the American people are smart enough to notice. This moment is different. The moment we find ourselves in today in 2026 is different because the data aligns. Public frustration aligns with financial evidence. Polling aligns with earning calls. Policy momentum aligns with cultural exhaustion. For decades, Big Pharma has operated behind complexity. Now the complexity that they have built is crumbling around them. The American people believe profits come before patients. They believe prices are too high, and they believe that reform of this industry is necessary. They support tying U.S. prices to international benchmarks. They support restricting excessive advertising. They support accountability, and this is not fringe, it's mainstream. And that is why Bust Big Pharma exists. We are not inventing outrage. We are articulating it. We're not manufacturing frustration. We're channeling it. We're not opposing innovation. We're demanding alignment. Because patience before profits should be our credo. Fairness before excess should be our standard. Transparency before spin should be expected. The data supports it. The culture reflects it. The moment demands it. And this is just the beginning. Now that we've talked about trust, Now that we've walked through polling, we've talked about the congressional hearings, and we've talked about these earnings calls that apparently these reforms didn't touch, we need to talk about something that every American sees. And they don't see it in a policy memo, and not in a think tank paper, and not even in a congressional hearing. They see it on their television. They see it on their phones. They see it on their computers. They see it on their streaming service. And they see it on their afternoon football games, during primetime dramas, or even during the Super Bowl. Commercials. Direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising commercials, to be exact. Because if you want a symbol of the imbalance of this system, you do not need a spreadsheet. You need a remote control. You know the formula. You've seen it 1,000 times. There's a couple walking through a meadow at sunset, a grandfather playing catch with a grandson, a woman gardening in soft light, smiles, warmth, hope, happiness, and then the voiceover, ask your doctor, followed by a rapid-fire list of side effects that sound like they were pulled from a medical horror story. Stroke, heart failure, seizures, depression, death. But don't worry. Look at the sunshine. Look at the breeze running through the tall grass. Look at that smiling couple. This isn't accidental. This isn't educational. It's strategy. And it's a multi-billion-dollar strategy. Last year alone, pharmaceutical companies spent more than $6 billion on direct-to-consumer television advertising. $6 billion. Let that breathe for a moment. They spent $6 billion on commercials, not on research, not on clinical trials, not on price reductions, not on rebates, on commercials. And in October of 2025 alone, the big pharmaceutical industry poured a record $307 million into TV ads in 1 month. $307 million. But that's not even where it gets outrageous. During the Super Bowl just the other week, where a 30-second ad cost roughly $8 million for 30 seconds, drug makers spent $48 million on just 3 minutes of airtime. That comes down to $266,000 per second. Per second. Now, here's the question every American instinctively asks. If you can afford $266,000 per second to sell medication, why can't you afford to lower the price? That question doesn't require ideology. That requires common sense. And when we tested that exact contrast in our national poll, when voters learned about the scale of pharmaceutical advertising, support for restricting or even prohibiting direct-to-consumer ads jumped dramatically. More than 70% of Americans support restricting these advertisements. Once again, this is not fringe. This is overwhelming, and it crosses party lines. Because Americans understand something simple. If you have $6 billion for marketing, you're not operating on razor-thin margins. Big Pharma tells Congress all the time that high prices are necessary for innovation. They say margins are fragile, and they say that every dollar matters. And they say reducing prices threatens research. But then they spend billions persuading Americans to ask for specific branded drugs. This is not survival spending. This is expansion spending. This is demand engineering. This is margin optimization. And here's what makes that contradiction sharper. Advertising expenses are tax deductible. So, taxpayers help subsidize the marketing machine that persuades them to buy higher priced drugs. Listen to that again. Americans help fund the commercials that encourage them to purchase medications that already cost more here than anywhere else in the developed world. If you were designing a system to frustrate the public, you could not do it more effectively. Now let's address the defense of this argument. The pharmaceutical industry claims that direct-to-consumer advertising educates patients. It informs them. But it educates them about what? About brand names? About lifestyle imagery? About asking for a specific product by name? What these ads almost never mention is price. What they almost never compare are low-cost alternatives. What they almost never emphasize is prevention, nutrition, or lifestyle modification. They sell an identity. They sell an association. They sell reassurance. And they do it brilliantly. That's not an insult. It's recognition. The industry is very, very good at marketing. Very good. So here's the question. Should prescription medications be marketed like luxury cars? Should therapeutic decisions be shaped by halftime commercials? Should the loudest voice in healthcare be a prime time ad buy? Most developed nations say no. In fact, the United States is one of only two countries in the world that allow direct-to-consumer pharmaceutical advertising at this scale. That's not an accident. Other nations understand the downstream impact that these ads have. When you saturate media with prescription ads, demand increases, utilization increases, spending increases, and prices don't go down. This isn't just an economic issue. You've heard me say that already. This is cultural. When you see 9 prescription drug ads per day, and that's roughly the average exposure for Americans watching television, something shifts. Medication becomes normalized as lifestyle. Ordinary human experiences become pharmaceutical opportunities. And then we are told high prices are unavoidable. When voters are informed about the scale of direct-to-consumer advertising, the billions that are spent annually, nearly 75% say that it makes them more skeptical of Big Pharma's claims that high prices are necessary for innovation. And that skepticism is rational, because the contradiction is visible. If innovation is so fragile, why is marketing so abundant? We're having an honest conversation, and we need to continue having this honest conversation. And part of that is that television networks rely heavily on pharmaceutical advertising revenue. Heavily. Primetime, cable news, major sporting events. Pharmaceutical advertising is not a minor revenue stream for them. It is the major one. Now ask yourself, how aggressively does a network scrutinize one of its largest advertisers? How frequently do anchors hammer the industry that funds their commercial breaks? This isn't conspiracy. It's economics. Advertising shapes ecosystems. And when $6 billion is flowing into television annually, incentives align, which means scrutiny often softens, which means narratives are shaped, which means the saturation continues until someone calls it out. And that's what we're doing here. Now picture this. A grandmother in Iowa is stretching her prescription because the copay increased. A father in Michigan is deciding whether to refill a medication or pay the electric bill. A senior in Florida is splitting pills in half to make them last. Now picture the Super Bowl. $48 million in 3 minutes. Smiling actors, sunsets, hope, side effects whispered at warp speeds. That contrast is why this issue resonates with Americans, because it's not abstract, it's visceral. And when voters see the contrast, they respond viscerally. When Americans are told about the scale of pharmaceutical advertising during major sporting events, a clear majority says that it makes them question whether drug prices are artificially inflated in order to fund marketing. That's not ideology, it's instinct. But it drives awareness, they argue. Yes, it does drive awareness. Congratulations, Big Pharma. It also drives demand, and demand drives revenue. And when revenue is demanded, it sustains margin. That's not controversial. It's marketing economics. And when you advertise a drug heavily, prescriptions for that drug increase. That has been documented repeatedly. So the idea that advertising is neutral information is disingenuous at best. It is persuasion, strategic persuasion. Now combine that with what we talked about earlier. Nearly 1,000 drug prices have been hiked this year alone. Profit margins are outpacing the broader market. Executives are earning 8 figures. Earning calls describe pricing adjustments as manageable. And yet $6 billion flows into commercials? It doesn't add up. Or rather, it adds up too clearly. President Donald J. Trump's administration has made it clear that Big Pharma's practices are completely under review. Secretary Kennedy has emphasized affordability and transparency, and there's a bipartisan momentum to examine direct-to-consumer advertising more seriously. Because when 70+% of voters support restricting these ads, when skepticism of pharmaceutical pricing claims rises dramatically after exposure to advertising data, lawmakers take notice too. And the industry is starting to take notice as well, which is why messaging intensifies, which is why you hear renewed arguments about education and empowerment. But empowerment without affordability is hollow. Information without price transparency is incomplete. And marketing without restraint erodes trust. Here's the simplest way I can frame it. If your industry is truly under strain, if your margins are truly fragile, if every dollar is necessary to sustain innovation, you do not spend $6 billion on television ads. You do not buy $8 million Super Bowl spots, and you do not flood the month of October in 2025 with $307 million of airtime. You tighten the belt. You consolidate. You conserve. You ask every family in middle America what they do when the budget is tight. Big Pharma didn't do that because Big Pharma is not under strain. It's under scrutiny, and scrutiny is different. Scrutiny forces explanations. It does not imply collapse. And that's why the earning calls that we talked about earlier were so calm. That's why executives used words like resilient and manageable. And that's why Americans increasingly reject the narrative that high prices are necessary. Because when you combine polling and financials and advertising budgets, the pattern is unmistakable. Direct-to-consumer advertising is not just a policy issue, it is a symbol of an industry that prioritizes demand expansion over price relief. It's a symbol of excess in a system where families are struggling. It's a symbol of how deeply commercialized healthcare has become. And symbols matter, especially in this country. They crystallize frustration. They clarify arguments. They sharpen contrast points. And when Americans see those commercials, they are not thinking about shareholder returns. They're thinking about their pharmacy receipt. And when those two realities collide, trust breaks down further. Which brings us back to where we started. Trust. 80% of Americans believe profits come before patients. 70+% support restricting pharmaceutical advertisement. And over 75% say they are less likely to vote for a candidate aligned with Big Pharma. That's not noise. That's a warning gong. In this conversation about direct-to-consumer advertising, it's not a side issue. It's a window. It's a window into priorities, a window into margins, a window into credibility. And if the industry wants to rebuild trust, it cannot ignore the optics of $6 billion in commercials while arguing that price reductions threaten survival. Because the American people see the contradiction, and they're done pretending that they don't. This frustration, this skepticism, this cultural shift doesn't stop here. The American people are crying out for it to be applied to a policy line that needs to be drawn in the sand. And that's exactly what the Trump administration has done with most favored nation pricing, where voluntary calm meets statutory accountability, and where the real test of reform begins. We've talked about trust. We've talked about advertising. We've talked about the congressional hearings. And now we've come to the fault line, the point where rhetoric collides with policy, and the moment where frustration either becomes reform or dissolves back into press releases. Most favored nation pricing, or as the American people understand it instinctively, America First drug pricing. Strip away the acronyms. Strip away the technical framing. Here's the principle. If a pharmaceutical company sells a drug cheaper in another developed country, Americans should receive that lowest price. Not a higher price, not a market-adjusted price, not a negotiated framework price, the lowest price. Simple, fair, intuitive, and wildly supported by the American people. When voters are asked whether the U.S. drug prices should be tied to the lowest prices paid in comparable developed countries, support approaches almost 80%. That's not narrow, and it's not partisan. It's consensus. And consensus is one of the hardest things to find in Washington, D.C. When you reach that level of bipartisan agreement, you're not dealing with ideology anymore. You're dealing with common sense. And the reason that support is so high is simple. Americans know they're paying more. They don't need a policy brief to tell them that. They know it when they travel. They know it when they compare prices, and they know it when they read international headlines. They know it when their pharmacy receipt prints. So when they hear the concept of most favored nation pricing, their reaction is not fear. It's relief. Finally. That's the word I guarantee you'll hear. Finally. For decades, pharmaceutical companies have operated in this global pricing structure that looks like this. In Europe and in other developed nations across the earth, governments negotiate aggressively. They cap prices, they limit reimbursement levels, they demand discounts, and pharmaceutical companies accept those lower prices because they still want access to those markets. But here, in the United States, we were told negotiation was dangerous. We were told price alignment was socialism. We were told American pricing had to remain high to fund global innovation. And for years, that narrative held. But narratives weaken when evidence contradicts them. And that brings us to the Axios story that broke just the other day. If you remember, the headline was Big Pharma Financially Unfazed by Drug Price Deals. It noted that major pharmaceutical companies barely mentioned their pricing agreements with the Trump administration during recent earnings calls. Why? Because those agreements had little to no noticeable impact on their bottom line. We've heard warnings for months. We've heard alarms. We've heard predictions of innovation collapse. And we've heard suggestions that reform would devastate pipelines here in the United States. And yet, when executives were speaking to shareholders, when they are legally obligated to disclose material impact, the tone was calm. It tells you that these reforms won't break the industry. It tells you that margins can remain strong. And it tells you resilience is intact. Pfizer's CEO spoke of, quote, greater clarity and, quote, underlying resilience. Eli Lilly said price concessions would be offset by expanded access. Novo Nordisk acknowledged adjustments but projected stability. This is not industry collapsing under reform. This is industry adapting to modest concessions. And that's what matters. Because if voluntary pricing adjustments are survivable, if earning calls remain calm, if shareholders remain confident, then the claim that fairness equals catastrophe begins to unravel. Now, this is where it gets serious. Axios also reported that while voluntary White House pricing deals may be tolerable for the industry, writing most favored nation pricing into law would not be. That's the dividing line. Voluntary concessions can be negotiated. Codified policy cannot. Voluntary agreements allow flexibility. Statutory reform creates permanence. Voluntary deals can be calibrated quietly. Law forces transparency. And Big Pharma thrives in calibration. They prefer ambiguity. They prefer negotiated frameworks. They prefer press releases over statute. Because ambiguity protects margins. Codification shifts leverage. And leverage is what most favored nation pricing represents. Now, President Trump made it clear that America would no longer subsidize the rest of the world's pharmaceutical costs. And that's why Secretary Kennedy has reinforced affordability as a moral imperative. And that's also why Dr. Oz has been engaging with lawmakers to move legislation forward. The White House messaging is consistent. Reduce unfair drug pricing for American patients without undermining life-saving innovation. It's a critical balance, because critics attempt to frame most favored nation as extreme. They use words like socialist, they warn of innovation decline, and they suggest global retaliation. But here's the reality. Foreign governments already impose pricing constraints. The United States is not importing price controls. The United States is responding to price disparity. If a company can profitably sell a drug in Germany at a lower price, if it can thrive in France at a lower price, if it can maintain margins in Japan at a lower price, then the claim that matching that price in America destroys innovation loses credibility. And their earning calls reinforce that reality. Remember the words they used: resilient, manageable, unfazed. Those words did not come from critics. Those words came from executives. Publicly, industry groups warned that codifying MFN would be devastating to research. Privately, they project confidence. Publicly, they frame price alignment as radical, but privately, they bake voluntary concessions into financial outlooks without blinking. There is a credibility gap in this industry, and that gap widens over time. Let's go back to the polling. When voters are informed that pharmaceutical companies describe pricing reforms as manageable on earnings calls, support for codifying most favored nation pricing increases even further, because the fear narrative collapses. Because the American people understand something instinctively. If the sky were truly falling, executives would be screaming on earnings calls, and they're not. Now, as most favored nation legislation gains traction and lobbying intensifies on Capitol Hill, there's something that needs to be recognized. Nearly $38 million flowed into Capitol Hill from pharmaceutical interests last year. $38 million. And that's not a defensive posture. That's a protective one, because when voluntary deals exist, the industry can manage outcomes. When codification looms, structural change becomes real. And structural change alters power. For decades, the United States has functioned as the global profit center for the pharmaceutical industry. High U.S. prices offset lower international pricing. American families carried the burden. Most favored nation pricing disrupts that dynamic. It says, if the rest of the developed world can negotiate fair prices, so can we. It says, if margins are sustainable abroad, they're sustainable here. It says America is no longer the world's ATM. And that message resonates because it feels overdue. We're not talking ideological theater. When 80% of voters support tying drug prices to lowest prices paid in other countries, when overwhelming majorities say drug prices are too high, and when most voters say they are less likely to support candidates associated with or aligned with Big Pharma, the political ground beneath our feet shifts. And lawmakers know it. This is why the congressional hearings are becoming sharper. This is why the Trump administration is pressing Congress. And this is why the message battle is intensifying. Because most favored nation pricing is not symbolic. It's structural. At its core, it's not about punishing success. It's not about eliminating profits. And it's not about dismantling innovation. It's about fairness. If Americans are funding foundational research through taxpayer dollars, if Americans are paying the highest retail prices in the world, if the American people are watching billions flow into advertising, if Americans are hearing earnings call describe pricing adjustments as manageable, then asking for parity is not radical. It's rational. It's measured. It's overdue. Voluntary deals are fragile. They depend on administration priorities. They depend on negotiation dynamics, and they depend on executive discretion. Codified law is durable. It provides predictability, it provides enforceability, and it provides clarity. And that is why the administration is urging Congress to act, because relief that can be reversed is not relief. Relief that is optional is not structural reform. Most favored nation pricing codified into law changes the baseline standard. It changes expectation and it changes leverage. So let me put it all together for you. Nearly 1,000 drug price hikes this year alone, $6 billion in advertising last year, profit margins outpacing the broader S&P market, executives earning 8-figure salaries, earnings calls described pricing concessions as manageable, voluntary deals characterized as survivable, and yet codification is described as catastrophic. That contradiction is glaring, and the American people see it. The polling confirms it. Americans want fairness. Americans want parity. Americans want accountability. They do not want slogans. They want structure. President Donald J. Trump opened the door. Secretary Kennedy reinforced the moral imperative, and Dr. Oz is engaging Congress. The public is aligned, the evidence is visible, and the earnings calls exposed the fear narrative. Now the question is simple. Will Congress codify fairness? Or will this just simply continue? Most favored nation pricing is the line in the sand. It is where voluntary relief becomes durable reform. It is where rhetoric becomes statute. It is where leverage shifts. And it is where this episode lands. This is Bust Big Pharma. And this is the moment of truth. I'll see you next time.